Starfleet uniforms. We've seen a lot of them over the years. Everyone's got their favorite, whether it be the classic original series uniform, the more stylized uniforms of the 90s, the ones that stand out from the pack, like the Monster Maroons from the old movies, or any of the uniforms from the more modern shows. Today, I'm going to be talking about my favorite uniform, which was one of our first looks at Star Trek in the 25th century, and no, I don't mean the uniform from Star Trek Picard. While Star Trek Picard did give us our first canon look at the 25th century, the second and third seasons taking place in the year 2401, but more than a decade before Star Trek Picard's premiere, Star Trek Online was already giving us a look at the year 2409. Now, the uniform I'm going to be talking about today mainly is Star Trek Online's Odyssey uniform. This is meant to be the main uniform used throughout Starfleet in Star Trek Online's timeline. However, it actually wasn't the first one that Star Trek Online used, so we're going to go over those a little bit before we get into the Odyssey uniforms. So, a little history lesson. When Star Trek Online first released, the main uniform used in that timeline was what they called the Sierra uniform. The Sierra uniforms were a bit of a departure from classic Starfleet uniform design, at least at the time. They still had all the classic Starfleet uniform elements that you saw throughout the Next Generation DS9 and Voyager, like the same division colors, a comm badge, rank pins. But the Sierra uniforms were much different in terms of texture, having a more leather jacket appearance, which, funny enough, is something Star Trek Picard would actually do in Season 3. The Sierra uniforms would also have a few other small differences compared to previous uniforms in Star Trek. Mainly that the comm badges now featured the old division logos from the original series, and the rank pins had been moved from the neck to the chest opposite the comm badge, which, again, is something Star Trek Picard also did for their uniforms in Season 1. Star Trek Online used the Sierra uniform for the first several years after its launch. However, it was eventually decided to introduce a new Starfleet uniform for the game, something that looked more like an evolution from the uniforms from existing Starfleet canon, which the Sierra uniforms never really did. The leather jacket look that they had, it never really looked like something that you would have seen in the shows. Plus, there was the fact that there were 5 different Sierra uniforms, so they wanted to create something with some more uniformity. And funny enough, this actually started when Star Trek Online introduced a Starfleet Academy uniform. This Academy uniform was designed by Star Trek Online character artist Matt Hyson and was introduced a number of years after the initial launch of the game, so it looked quite a lot different from the Sierra uniforms. Moving the division color to a stripe that ran across the lower shoulders, kind of like the white stripe on the lower decks uniforms, with an additional color stripe down the side of the pants. And changing the base color of the uniform to a dark navy blue. This Academy uniform would also lose the leather texture that the Sierra uniforms had in favor of a more fabric-like texture. It also featured a variant with a skirt, which is, again, something we hadn't seen from a Starfleet uniform in a long while. Once the Starfleet Academy uniform was introduced into Star Trek Online's in-game store, this would be the jumping-off point for the design of Star Trek Online's new main Starfleet uniform, the Odyssey uniform. Matt Hyson would also design this uniform, but this time in collaboration with Star Trek Online artist Thomas Maroney, who at the time I think was still working on the UI art, but would later become the head of Star Trek Online's ship art team. Character artist Joe Jing also did some polish work on the Odyssey uniform before it finally released. The Odyssey uniform would have a number of very familiar design elements, but at the same time would also feature a number of its own unique elements. At first glance, you can see some clear similarities to the 2373 uniform introduced in Star Trek First Contact and the later seasons of Deep Space Nine, particularly because of the gray shoulders on the jacket of the uniform, and a shirt under the jacket that would feature the division color, which was visible around the collar. But just like the Academy uniform, this one featured a stripe of the division color beneath the shoulder section. The rank pips would return to their classic position of being on the right side of the collar. However, the shape of the pips changed. Instead of being the classic round ones from the show, these were a sharp rectangular shape. The shoulder section also featured these seams that kind of accentuated the look of the uniform itself. This gave the jacket a bit more of a textured look than the classic Voyager uniform, but kept it from being as busy as the quilted texture that the Deep Space Nine and First Contact uniform had. Which I think was a good thing, because while I love the quilted look on the First Contact uniform, I think that plus the extra division color stripe on the Odyssey uniform would have been too much. The way they ended up doing it for the Odyssey uniform I think worked really well for it. They kept the same comm badge from the original Sierra uniform on the Odyssey uniform, but they did change the standard color from gold to silver, making it a bit more reminiscent of the badges used in Next Gen DS9 and Voyager. The rank pips would also be changed to silver as well. Now, one of the things I like about the Odyssey uniform so much is the amount of variety they introduced into it. Because in Star Trek Online, the base uniform actually has a number of different options that the standard uniforms didn't have throughout the shows. At least, not at the time. One big difference was that they actually made exclusive color variants to the captain and medical uniforms. The captain's uniform being very similar to the standard duty uniform, except instead of gray shoulders, it featured white. And for the medical uniform, it changed the black section to white, allowing it to be differentiated from the science uniform. Star Trek Online also introduced a new division color for Starfleet intelligence officers. Originally they used black for Starfleet intelligence, but recently changed it to violet. I'm not really sure what prompted the change, but honestly I like the violet color better. Oh, another big change that the Odyssey uniform has is that it has a belt, which is not something we've seen on a standard duty uniform since the Monster Maroons. Variants of the Odyssey uniform actually go beyond just simple color changes. There's also a long jacket uniform, which is meant to be used by flag officers. You know, like admirals, who also get another color scheme along with it. Instead of gray or white shoulders, they get black that matches the rest of the uniform, along with some silver or gold highlighting depending on what rank of admiral they're at. Commodore, Rear Admiral, and Vice Admiral all got silver, while Full Admiral and Fleet Admiral were gold. And the long jacket uniform has some extra color around the wrists. Oddly enough, while the long jacket uniform was made for admirals, there are some captain characters that also wear the long jacket uniform, still wearing the captain's colors, but yeah, it's clearly the long jacket. I don't really know what the deal is there. Star Trek Online also introduced two other variants for the Odyssey uniform, the dress uniform and the excursion uniform. Both of these were modeled and textured by Star Trek Online artist Ian Castaneda, with polish work once again being done by Joe Jing. Now, just looking at the Odyssey dress uniform, you can see a very clear inspiration from the old Monster Maroons, thanks to the asymmetric flap jacket and the clasp that comes over the right shoulder. But obviously there are some notable differences between this and the old Monster Maroon, mainly the color. They're not maroon, they're actually white. And I think that was meant to be an homage to modern Navy dress white uniforms, which I think was a really interesting choice because not only does it give it some sort of real-world connection, but at the same time allows it to stand out that much more from the standard duty uniform. Now, obviously, it still bears some strong similarities to the standard Odyssey uniform, like the division color still being in the same spot, and it still uses the same comm badge and rank pins, but changes their color to gold, probably because the standard silver ones wouldn't stand out very well against the white uniform. An interesting note on these, the pants from the dress uniform are actually just the same pants from the Academy uniform. That's why, unlike the standard uniform, these also feature the division color down the pants. The excursion uniform is a bit different from the other variants. Instead of a jacket and pants like the other variants, the excursion uniform is a one-piece jumpsuit. It's meant to be much more tactical-oriented, featuring what look like light armor plating beneath the surface, as well as featuring pockets on the arms and legs and large combat-style boots. The color scheme on these is meant to be much more different as well, still featuring that division color stripe that all the other variants have, but this one features much more gray than the others. The excursion uniform also doesn't feature a variant for captains and flag officers. I remember someone commenting about this on Twitter once, and I remember Thomas Maroney's response was something along the lines of, well, in a combat situation, you don't want your high-ranking officer standing out too much, which makes sense. Now, a little background information around the Odyssey uniform. They were applied to the entire Federation faction in Star Trek Online's Season 9.5 update in July of 2014. This effectively retconned the Sierra uniform from Star Trek Online's timeline, because they have not seen on any NPCs since. This was done to give the Federation faction a much more uniform look that we were accustomed to seeing in the Star Trek shows. Again, this is before Star Trek's Picard, Lower Decks, and Prodigy introduced multiple overlapping uniforms into the latter part of the 24th century. And I actually didn't know about this until recently, but Thomas Maroney told me that the Odyssey uniform was originally meant to be released via Star Trek Online's fleet system. Not only that, but it was originally intended to be exclusive for the Enterprise F. It wasn't until further along in its development that Thomas Maroney suggested that it be applied to the entire faction of the Federation. Again, to replicate that more uniform look that we had grown accustomed to through the older shows. When they decided to go through with that decision, they didn't like the idea of the new standard Starfleet uniform, the Odyssey uniform, being locked behind the game's fleet system. So it was decided to give the Odyssey uniform to players for free, but they still wanted something to be added to the fleet system to incentivize players to join fleets to take part in that sort of content. So to take that place, they developed the dress and excursion versions of the uniform, and made them purchasable through the in-game fleet starbases. The long jacket variant was made part of Star Trek Online's old veteran reward system, which is now only accessible via the lifetime subscription. While asking Thomas Maroney questions on this topic, he sent me some early concept art that both he and Matt Hyson did for the Odyssey uniform. While the final product wasn't 100% identical to one concept versus the other, it's really interesting to me how elements of both of them ended up inspiring the two variants. This version that Thomas did has a cross-flap jacket version, which I'm sure he was inspired by for the Monster Maroons. While it is kind of funny that the Odyssey uniform didn't end up doing this for the standard duty uniform, both Star Trek Lower Decks and Picard would end up doing this much later on. Because keep in mind, the Odyssey uniform wasn't released into Star Trek Online until 2014, meaning this concept art is even older than that. While Thomas Maroney's version is a bit more closer to what ended up being the dress uniform, Matt Heison's uniform ended up being a bit closer to the excursion uniform, it being a one-piece jumpsuit, which also gives it a rather strong resemblance to the early TNG-era uniforms. Something you can also see here on Heison's version is that the comm badge is a hollowed-out delta. In the game, both the excursion and dress uniforms come with unique comm badges, both of which are a form of hollowed-out delta. The excursion's version being just a hollow delta, and the dress uniform having a small gold bar on the back of it, making it vaguely reminiscent of the Voyager comm badge. This delta is very reminiscent of that from the All Good Things badge. Basically just take off the back piece from it and it would look the same. Which I imagine was the thinking for this comm badge, that it was meant to be sort of an evolution of the All Good Things badge. Because Thomas told me, originally the plan was for that hollow comm badge to be the standard for the Odyssey uniform. But again, they didn't want the new standard badge being locked behind the game's fleet system. So they just kept the old badges from the Sierra uniforms and just changed the color. So yeah, that is the Odyssey uniform from Star Trek Online. I really like this uniform. I think it looks really good. I think it makes a really great evolution based off of prior uniforms from the timeline. Though at this point, you kind of have to keep in mind when this uniform was made. But yeah, it falls in line really well with Star Trek's legacy of other uniforms, while at the same time doing a really good job of doing its own thing. And in other cases, it did first what other uniforms would do later. Like how the Star Trek Discovery uniforms had a version that was unique to both medical personnel and the ship's captain. Star Trek Online did that first. It also brought back some interesting elements from older uniforms, like how the dress uniforms are clearly inspired by the Monster Maroons, or making an excursion uniform, which again is something we really didn't see past the TMP era. There's even a version for enlisted personnel. I totally forgot to go over that. The NCO uniform is basically just the same uniform jacket as the Odyssey uniform, just with the color palette switched around. But again, it's just really interesting to me that Star Trek Online went to the effort of putting that extra kind of detail, because again, it's not something we've seen since the old movies. Of course, that's not meant to be a slight against the TV shows, either the old ones or the new ones. Obviously, it's a lot easier for Star Trek Online to implement that sort of thing, especially because they were using existing assets. Versus a TV show where they would literally have to make whole new costumes just for background characters. It becomes a huge expense at that point. But again, it's just a detail I really like seeing in Star Trek. And it's just one more reason for me to love the Odyssey uniform as much as I do. But yeah, be sure to let me know what you guys think of the Odyssey uniform down below in the comments, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. If you would like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or you can find the link to the merch store down below, or if you are ever shopping on the Epic Game Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701. These really help me out, and I really do appreciate it. Either way though, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.